The following is my conversation with Melissa Owen. Melissa Owen is an ESG and regulatory affairs expert with over 25 years of experience helping global companies launch and manage products across Latin America. Through her firm, Ambiente Legal, Melissa provides strategic guidance on compliance, sustainability reporting, extended producer responsibility, and cross-border product regulations across sectors like chemicals, tech, textiles, and food focused exclusively on Latin America. Fluent in 5 languages and a licensed US attorney, Melissa is a recognized speaker, mentor, and publisher of the influential Around Latin America newsletter, a must read for anyone working in the global product compliance space. So, without any further ado, let me give you Melissa Owen.
Well, good to see you again, Melissa. And, I know a lot to talk about, but I think one thing that, maybe we should just start off with is, especially given, our viewership and your viewership as well, is just talk us through your journey. Like, how did you get started with, compliance, ESG, and then also tell us a little bit about the sort of South America angle here and, sort of.
Yeah, I get asked that a lot because sometimes it takes a minute to figure out how it ended up this way.
Right.
It makes more sense with just a few key facts. One, I'm from Mexico, so I'm Mexican born. I moved to the United States when I was in junior high school. So I've always been bicultural or a third culture kid, if you will. Spanish is my first language. My passion for Latin America comes from my Mexicanicity, I think. No brainer. I was a kid that actually liked all of school, liked all subjects. So it was very hard to kind of select. And once I got into, I went to university in the United States, in Texas, and I really liked biology and especially what at the time was called ecology. So I really liked my ecology classes. When I ended up deciding to go into law school, long story there over drinks, and went to law school, I realized that I could bring it all together and I could do environmental law. So then you're using all of your biology background and all of my ecology in undergrad and bring it to the law field. But I knew I wanted to work with Latin America. So I said, well, I'm going to do Latin American environmental law. And when I interviewed with law firms there in Austin, Texas, where I was, they would kind of look at me funny, like, is there such a thing? Is this an area? And I finally found a firm with a woman that was half Mexican, half Irish herself. And she was in charge of the environmental department. And she said, let's do it. Let's build it. And so I was supported by my firm to set up what is now, they still have an ongoing Latin American practice group that she and I launched together. So that explains it. I loved biology. I'm from Mexico. Spanish is my first language. Since then, over the years, I've realized that to work in Latin America, you cannot not speak Portuguese because of Brazil, the largest country in the region, first or second largest market, depending on the year with Mexico. And so I now speak fluent Portuguese, been working on that. And so I've been helping US, European, any kind of multinational company with plants or products in Latin America for over 25 years now. So that kind of is my journey in a nutshell.
That's amazing. And so let's dive a little bit into that. Like I'm a US manufacturer, I'm a European manufacturer. I want to enter into Latin America. I don't know how to navigate the regulatory landscape. Maybe talk about just some high level thing to get the conversation started about what are the things that
Absolutely. And I think that the way you're describing it is actually my favorite point to meet a company coming into Latin America before they've gotten there, because that's where I can really bring my knowledge of the region, not just of the subject matter, to bear. Just calls I was on recently, when someone, let's say you are a company that has a novel pesticide and you want to take this molecule to Latin America. I come in and meet with the team early in the process to help identify what would be a good country to take that to. Where are there regulatory opportunities? It's important to think that regulations are not always just a compliance pain. They can actually be a leverage point. For example, the government in Argentina has deregulated a lot around pesticides and agrochemical products in the last year or two under President Milei. So these are market opportunities. You've got a novel chemical. Let's take it to a novel agrochemical. Let's take it to Argentina and get it registered and benefit from getting into Latin America through that country. So that's one way I help. The other is, let's say you have a fabulous cleaning product and you want to take it to all of Latin America. I come in and help you realize maybe let's do it in phases and not take on 25 countries at once. Let's select where are you most likely to have the biggest market. Like if it's cosmetics, Brazil is the 4th largest cosmetics consumer in the world. So let's start there. And then so far as regulations are concerned, I help the clients understand some of the big issues that come up, specifically in regulated products, where it's not a chair or a book, but we're talking about pesticides, food products, regulated consumer goods in our own country. Anything our FDA or EPA might regulate, Latin America does as well. And it's on a country by country basis. There is no EU, so you can't register in LATAM. LATAM is kind of a fiction. It's something that can't even be agreed on. Some of my clients in their corporate structure, Mexico is North America. For me, Mexico is Latin America. So it's a really big region. And I think when we talk about it like that, we make people sometimes think that for regulations, there is an EU level organization, and there is not. There are trade blocks, and some of them do give benefits to registration, like the Andean community. If you register a cosmetic in Peru, you can then register by equivalency quite easily in Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia, the other impact members. Not the same for Mercosur, where you would have to go country by country. Regulation or registration of your product in Argentina does not mean you are registered by equivalency in Brazil. So helping them understand the complexity of the region and where there might be some regulatory advantages, and then understanding just the regulatory landscape applicable to their products. Where are we going to need to register? And if you're this foreign company that has nobody in the country for these regulated products, one of the big hurdles is what's called local presence. You cannot, as a foreigner, register the product, period, the end. Must be a local entity. So there's several different options for that. You can have your distributor appointed as the entity, hire a consultant that does registration hosting, or I help companies spin up their local subsidiary. So then we get the subsidiary built, and that can go register, and all kinds of different strategies around those 3 options. Which one makes sense in what scenario?
In terms of the frameworks itself, like how European has its ROHS, REACH, etc. And many other or at least the saying is that, the EU is the most regulated, sort of entity in the world, and it has the most strictest regulations. And a lot of countries have sort of followed suit, right? They said, well, if EU has ROHS, we have our China version of it, which is ROHS, and we're just going to sort of, copy from that. Is Latin America also similar in the sense that it's mostly borrowed from some existing regulatory frameworks, or is it its own beast that one has to navigate?
That is a fabulous question, and it's literally my career. Yes. So Latin American environmental regulations, I've been at this long enough, 30 years now. In the beginning, were always inspired by the U.S. It was the U.S. EPA standards that were looked to most often. In the interim, the U.S. did not go forward with the Kyoto Protocol, the precursor to the Paris Agreement. Broke Latin America's heart. In the interim, the EU became more and more progressive in its environmental agenda. And now most of Latin America looks to the EU precedent for its own environmental schemes. And we see it, like you're saying, in very specific areas. It is not a cut and paste, but it's a cut and localization. It is not a cut and paste. So you cannot come in, but it will help you understand in some things. So LATAM has copied, for example, like you're talking about the restriction on hazardous substances, it's coming. Brazil Ross will be the first. But for other things, it's much more well adapted and entrenched for extended producer responsibility, for the WE directive for waste electric equipment and electronics. Each country in Latin America of the major economies has it now, its own directives or regulations, if you will, and they expand it to a much broader list of regulated products that require extended producer responsibility at the national level, and for Brazil and Mexico at the subnational level, which would be the states in Brazil and Mexico and the provinces in Argentina. And we're seeing it come online. The thing I spend so much of my time talking about is the REACH-inspired regulations in Latin America now. Brazil, Peru, Colombia, and Chile have copied the EU plan, but not at all at the level of detail. It is not true REACH, but it's REACH-inspired. But we have to do a segue there. So how do some of these come to Latin America? Is it just that the regulators are inspired by the EU? Yes, sometimes, but other times the EU goes out and does actual promotion like they did for the EPR rules. EMPA out of Switzerland had 2 people come and do dog and pony shows in the early 2000s around Latin American countries for free, coming to teach them about the gospel of extended producer responsibility, and Latin American countries liked it and adopted it. It makes sense in our contexts. But then for the REACH-inspired rules, they're actually coming in online in Peru, Chile, and Colombia, specifically because of the OECD. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is a very coveted membership for Latin American countries. We want to be in that country club of trading partners. And so as the OECD comes and does the assessments, they do a gap analysis of our regulations for each country up for accession. And they produce a report saying, you really need to adopt this, this, and this. And across the board, they have told each of our countries so far that we need this chemical framework scheme. And so Latin American countries then go, okay, we need to do that. And the EU model, REACH, is so well known. But also, Kunal, it's really interesting. You have brilliant teams in Latin American government who are understaffed and underfunded. So if they can go to the EU and get the model regulation in their language, because the EU translates to Spanish for Spain and Portuguese for Portugal. So we can go and get those models. Whereas if it were for the US, we'd have to go and translate it. And I think that's one of the drivers is the ease with which we can look at these model standards coming out of the European Union. And it's also because REACH is so well known. But the OECD has been the big driver. Publicly, the government acknowledges that in Chile, Peru, and Colombia.
I see. Wow, that's amazing. And then how ready are suppliers, etc., for the landscape in Latin America? Borrowing from the US and the EU, they're a little more mature markets. People know what to do there. They know, well, I've got to get my documentation ready for REACH, for OHS, etc. Is that the state of affairs down south as well, or is it like developing right now? Like people are trying to figure out like how, what documentation do I need, for example?
It's absolutely developing. On calls just this week with companies where, and I think let's take REACH for an example. So let's say you are a US or European multinational with a local entity in these countries. I think one of the things that they have not perhaps done as much as they could have is support those local branches in understanding the laws coming online in the South American country. So for example, one client recently realized that the deadline has passed, that they had not gotten their registration done in Chile within time because the local entity was not even aware of the existence of this regulation. They're not classically a chemical company. They are just a final product that gets caught up in these chemical regulations. And so I think that to the extent these regulations are new, we are not there is a learning curve for all of the local entities in Latin America with regard to some of these really new things, like the REACH-inspired regulation. With regard to registration of regulated products like pesticides and all, they're incredibly sophisticated. They already know how to do that. They've been doing it for decades. But for some of these newer things, or some of like the EUDR out of Europe, that's going to require due diligence statements about traceability and coming from deforested areas and certifications and all, I think there is still a lot of education to do up and down the supply chain.
Got it. That makes sense. And is it quite tech friendly, the atmosphere down there, like in terms of even product registration, for example? Like, is it all API based? You can do it online? Or does it have to go through, like what does that look like?
It depends on the country. There really is a move toward what we call in Spanish digitalization. So each country is trying to build these online platforms to where it will be human contact free. You will do you will upload. And Brazil's FDA analog Anvisa is working greatly on how to make all of these filings online. Mexico's FDA analog COFEPRIS, it's their big objective this year. They are moving to simplification of forms and making them all online. For now, it's still a hybrid. It's unlikely that you are not going to have to do some of this filing at some point. But I think that Latin American countries saw the benefits of the digital platforms helping them when they are understaffed and underfunded. And so they all have an online presence. They all have online processes. But some of it, during the height of the pandemic, I was helping companies literally just find somebody that could go walk a permit into the agency in Quito, Ecuador, because of the lack of these digital platforms. But I'm a big proponent that these countries are on the cutting edge. Latin America is very tech friendly, embraces tech. We have brilliant engineers. I even help companies here in California, even though I'm right down from Silicon Valley, source tech talent out of Bogota, out of Santiago, out of Buenos Aires. So very tech savvy, and to the extent that they can do it without too much budget, they will. It's not a lack of desire or intellect. Sometimes it's just a funding issue.
Right. And Melissa, we talked about sustainability and some of materials and frameworks of sorts. But does that also apply to standards in quality, safety, and other areas as well around if we have to cover the landscape of regulatory market access as a whole? How much are you seeing on the other side of quality testing and some of that the government is mandating?
So ESG is coming to Latin America, and actually it's continuing its slow march. What I've seen is a decoupling. The EU and the US were way out in front. EU in front, US behind. And I am seeing them now walk back from their commitments. They are cutting back. The SEC in the United States is not moving forward with mandatory climate reporting. The EU is revising downward its ESG ambition. And in the meantime, China, Brazil, Mexico, they're just continuing to move forward. So ESG is definitely coming online. We're having this call today, just this week. The big news, Brazil formally approved its sustainable taxonomy. I mean, this is huge news. So there are now formal definitions of what it means to be a sustainable nickel mining company in Brazil. We have that now in the taxonomy. And Brazil, as well as Mexico, are countries that are now requiring mandatory sustainable reporting for listed companies as of 2026 in Brazil. I mean, this is really big stuff. So I don't think ESG is going away at all in Latin America. It may not be at the EU level, but again, if the EU is moving backward and they continue their slow march forward, I don't know at what point we won't be at parity in those requirements. So if you are a company active in Latin America, you definitely need to be aware and ask, if we're a locally listed company, is there a mandatory climate reporting? Is there something sustainability reporting? What standard did they adopt? Absolutely. For Brazil and Mexico in particular, that should be on your horizon.
Yeah. You know, some companies I talk to, sometimes they give me the classic, well, no one's going to crack down on this, even if I'm not fully compliant. And I get the very classic answer. And I know it's definitely not going to happen in LATAM. Maybe talk to them about, what's the ramifications of non-compliance, how should, what's going to happen if they don't register or they're not sort of compliant with some of these frameworks that the government's putting together. Like, what are your legal perspective as well would be very useful here.
I think what they're asking you about is their risk exposure, right? That's really what this is. What is our risk? And so as lawyers, I think especially in environmental law, we're very comfortable as risk managers because there is rarely an industrial facility without some environmental impact. So it's really about understanding it, managing it. So risk management is something I've been working on for 3 decades. And I think in Latin America, as a multinational company, you have to be very careful assuming that there are no risks to noncompliance. The classic risk would be enforcement. So is the government going to come and lock my factory up, arrest my managers? Are they going to put a border hold on your products? In several Latin American countries, there is, because of this lack of funding and lack of staffing, less enforcement than you might see in the U.S. Well, not in the U.S. currently, but in the U.S. formerly, for example. Formerly, there might have been more enforcement. So it's not that the laws don't exist or that you need to comply with them, but I will acknowledge that enforcement has not been at the level that it would have been in the EU or the US. But it's hard to generalize. For example, I cannot believe how active the Argentine FDA is on a weekly basis, ferreting out companies that are advertising cleaning products on TikTok that don't have their sanitary registration, ends up in the Argentine newspaper on a weekly basis. I'm not taking these actions, even right now, even under their libertarian president, Milei. So it's hard to generalize, but there is less enforcement. What I would tell those companies, though, is It is no longer something that you can hide. Enforcement now is only one of the risks you face. Everybody knows everything. And we need to remember that NGOs have only gotten more sophisticated. They're using AI too, people. They're not, So now, for example, your carbon footprint can be known thanks to satellites and drones by third-party NGOs. It's not something you can hide anymore. They will be able to access that information. Data is for everyone. So I would say that your risks of an NGO action have only gone up because of that. Especially in Latin America, we have a sui generis international treaty known as the Escazú Agreement that countries are having to contend with now, which calls for transparency and environmental information. So more and more you're going to see. And then a trend I follow, which is super interesting, is we are seeing more and more international tort liability for environmental harm in Latin America in courts in The Hague, in courts in London. And so you are seeing now major mining lawsuits for tailing dam disasters known as Mariana, and they're known by the name where they happened, that happened in Brazil. Those tort suits are proceeding with international tort lawyers pursuing action against those companies in EU courts. So they're not worried about the Brazilian law that may not give them, as much recovery. They're just going and finding courts that are more friendly to a tort suit and or, have structures that they think that they can hold the company accountable in. So I would just say that as the global footprint of these companies grows, so does the tort lawyer footprint, so does the NGO footprint. They can know more and more. So you face risk not just from enforcement from government, but from these third-party lawsuits and actors.
Yes, and I'm sure there's an army of lawyers always or some, players waiting out there to find who are those companies that are non-compliant and, can we start going after them? And I wonder if that exists there. I know it exists here in the US.
Absolutely. Particularly with an international firm that I track and monitor, which has offices in Brazil and offices in the UK, and they are constantly hiring. So absolutely, I see that coming more and more. But I think that we need to talk about non-compliance. I want to be very specific about the risks. Non-compliance from a regulatory perspective, I don't have my permit, for example. That is not something a law firm is going to pursue. I don't have my permit and I caused an accident. That's what's going to be pursued. But the I don't have my permit can be a risk that you may just get that customs official that happens to look at that box and go, wait, this is not, you don't have the registrations required. And that's where I so often get brought in is customs hold. Customs holds definitely happen. That label isn't right. You mischaracterized. The tariff classification doesn't match up with the classification that the custom official expects for that product, because customs officials in Latin America have a great deal of discretion. So border access is one of the ways that I think that these companies need to be thinking about compliance. Border access is better if you are in compliance with the local regulation.
And in the worst case that a company does get stuck in one of these, like I don't have my permit and someone, caught me at the border or some customer official caught me. Like, how do you navigate the legalities out of that? It's just working with maybe a firm like yours, or like how
Absolutely. We it's super fact intensive. We get local and we get local. So that's where I work with. I'm very blessed. My team is a network of local counsel and technical consultants that get brought in on that kind of stuff on a regular basis. So then we have to go in and meet with the officials and talk about, what is this? How can we move forward? Whether it's the customs officials or if the actual regulatory agency for that product has been involved. So that's where you have to go in, sometimes with local counsel, sometimes technical consultant, and try to untie the knot that my clients find themselves in.
Yeah, I can imagine that could be, very, very painful. Are you seeing the reverse too? Like a lot of companies in LATAM sort of wanting to sell outside to the US and EU, and then how do they will you help them navigate even that sort of, like how do you enter into the EU, enter the US?
Yeah, you do see that. Absolutely. Particularly when you think that Latin America, two different things, industrialized products, as we call it in Latin America, or commodities. For commodities, Latin America is the grain basket of the world, so you have us selling our products everywhere. So you do start having Latin American producers and growers say, wow, Chihuahua, what are we going to do with this EUDR? How are we going to continue selling our cocoa and our soy and our wood products and all from Colombia, small stakeholder farms from Brazil? So you see definitely those companies going out and trying to understand their compliance obligations. But then you find, believe it or not, the United States has instituted a new requirement for the first time ever. It came online about a year ago for registration of cosmetics products. We didn't have that before, and it's known as MOCRA. That's the MOCRA is the acronym. And I do get requests. You have Latin American companies that make there's some large cosmetics companies out of Brazil and Mexico that want to sell into the US market. And they're like, oh my gosh, now I've got to register. What do we need to do? I do not do US or Canadian law. So I actually just help them find colleagues of mine that are rock stars in that. And I just help get them encaminados, as we say in Spanish, on their path toward a representation with colleagues of mine. It's not something I go south, they go north. So I put them on the right rail car.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So let's just say, just to go back to maybe a little bit of the initial conversation too, if I'm a company, I want to start sort of selling in LATAM, like maybe break it down into 3 or 4. What are the top 3, 5 things I should start thinking about right now before I even approach you or approach someone like you and say, before I approach Melissa, what should I get in order right now before I can, go and have a conversation with Melissa and her team to help me sell there?
Number one, is there a market for your product? So I talk to companies about this all the time. If you have this, I've invented this fantastic new cleaning product. I'm convinced Latin America needs household cleaning product. Let's take that as an example. I'm a US inventor. I have this thing. It's going to blow up. So first thing to think about is go to AI, go to your market teams. I don't know how big a company we're talking about, and figure out if there's a market for your product for this in Latin America. Are the customs and local, and I don't mean customs authorities, I mean local traditions, are they open to this kind of product? Is this something that they would use? Is it something that they're interested in? If they are, what countries should you go into first? Latin America is the elephant, and I would eat it one bite at a time. So I try to help companies understand, let's layer maps to figure out, okay, Latin America generally is a market for our product. We found out through AI or talking to you, Kunal, or somebody else talking to me. On top of that, what countries would be good to attack first? Companies come to me and go, we're going all of Latin America. And I go, whoa there, let's slow down. Let's choose 3 or 4 countries. So the top 6 markets generally, because they're the largest markets, if you really just don't have a specific thing, it's just a cleaning product and there's houses everywhere, then you would go to Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, and Argentina. Those are the largest markets. So that's where you would go. If you are, though, a pesticide and you're really good on tropical fruits, then maybe you're actually going to Central America. So it's that analysis of product and fit for purpose and where to take it, and then break Latin America down into 2, 3, or 4 initial markets. And then I would do some deeper market analysis. How good is the market there? How does it work? And then immediately get in touch with your regulatory support. Because on some of these products, like a novel pesticide, 5 or 6 years before you get your permits to bring this thing to market. And then we come up against my old friend, local presence, like I was talking about. Europe's fully foreign company. How will you even enter the market into these countries with a regulated product like cleaning products? Household cleaning products are registerable through the health authorities in most of Latin America. So you're going to need a local entity. Do we spin that up, or do we go with your distributor in the beginning because you've met somebody over drinks somewhere at an AmCham meeting and they said, we can sell this all over Central America for you? So that may be a great way to do it in the beginning. If you do go that route, make sure you've got really good local counsel. The distributor agreement, if it's a regulated product, includes really clear language about the fact that you will claw back that registration into your own name and they need to give it back to you once it's a big, rich market and you form your local entity, because you don't want to be held hostage by a local distributor. I have clients that have had that happen. So the big picture would be break Latin America down into sizable chunks, analyze whether or not there's really a market for your product, and then jump in on the regulatory road mapping. You need to know the cost of entering those markets. What will it cost you both in time and money to be at? What's the investment, and is the market worth it?
Are there any figures around that? Like how expensive could it be for an average product, like a cleaning product, for example?
There is no average. Absolutely not. It's country specific, sector specific. If you're selling chairs and you don't need to go through registration process, much easier than if you're talking about a food contact material, a food and beverage. And then don't forget all the niggly details that you're going to get. You're going to spend more time on labeling than you ever thought possible. Getting the label right, very specific labeling standards. And those are border access, for example, in Mexico. If your product is subject to what's known as an official Mexican standard on labeling, and it applies to a lot of things from spray paints to electronics, you need that NOM label correct. And you might even need conformity assessment, NOM certification, or conformity assessment through. So the regulatory roadmap, get on that soon. Once you determine that there is a market, get on the regulatory side of it to find out what that cost is going to be for you.
Yeah. So surprised when you said that it could take, 4 or 5 years sometimes to get. I mean, this, just means that one has to certainly get ahead of it, sooner than later.
That is really like that. That's a worst case scenario. And that's for
Yeah.
the heavily regulated sectors like
Right.
pesticides, where it can take years all over the world. It's not only in Latin America, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. Getting a novel molecule to market in Latin America is a slow burn.
I can imagine. And within Latin America, are there certain countries that you would say, well, Brazil is way more regulated compared to, Peru or something?
Yes, there are. And you chose the right one. Brazil is known for its very complex regulatory and tax structures. There was even a term, I used to be acting regional counsel for a big OEM computer company. And so I was the regional counsel in charge of launching the Brazil factory and did that for several years. And so I learned the term custo Brasil, the Brazil cost. You have to figure whatever the regulatory or launch cost is going to be in Peru, there's going to be an extra layer for Brazil. Some of that is because we have to remember the 3 federated republics. So in Latin America, there are 3 major federated republics: Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. And that means that there is not only national compliance, but state compliance, like our own US. So if you were going to launch in the US, maybe California regulates more than Texas does. So you might move a plant based on that. And it's the same in Brazil, that you are going to find that if you launch in Sao Paulo, it's more sophisticated environmental regime and more regulation than perhaps launching in Goiás or another state, maybe out in the more rural north. So there's even subnational variations on the cost and compliance timeline. So a lot to keep in mind.
Let's shifting more on the people aspect of dealing with folks in LATAM. How should US and European companies that want to enter LATAM think about the culture there, think about relationships there? I mean, you're on the ground there, so you understand, right, how some of that works. And how do you bridge the gap between how we think about things here in the US versus how LATAM relationships are managed and maintained?
I think that's my favorite question, because
Yeah.
my passion is to be a bridge for my
Right.
clients between their culture and Latin America. And so I think that if you are a foreign company coming to Latin America, the first thing to remember is that we are not the EU, we're not the US, we're not ASEAN. We each have our own national agendas, national policies. So come with a level of humility. Come and do deep listening, do deep learning. Come and get to know the market. Also in Latin America, it's hard to generalize. We're talking about over 20 countries, but if you allow me to, we are very warm and social people. So interaction, the human side of things is definitely bigger than in some other countries where I help my clients. That's all I'll say, is that we are, when you get on the call, for example, just managing your meetings, get on the call, get to know the people. What have they done that weekend? Discuss some sports teams if it's not too hot a topic. Soccer is very serious in our region.
Yes.
So you got to be careful whose team you're backing, but get to know the people. And then, of course, if you're serious about making the investment in Latin America, get local. Get teams that don't sit in Brussels and tell you they cover Latin America. Ask them, do you live in Latin America? Are you from Latin America? Do you speak Spanish? Do you speak Portuguese? You really will get further knowing the local language. Most high-level business people and even mid-tier business people in Latin America speak English. We've had to learn English to get outside of our countries, right? But if you can speak to them in their own language, you'll win hearts and minds. you will absolutely have a different kind of relationship. And I would argue a more profitable one, and even maybe one that moves faster and more efficiently than if you are having to interact with them in their second or third language.
Yeah, I was going to ask around, languages as well, and you covered that around, how important it is, uh, you know, and do you think that you'd get the same level of social interaction even though you had a translator, for example, like you helping sort of bridge that gap, or
Well,
is
I
it?
think I think
Yeah,
it would definitely help. Yeah, if you just don't know the language, then that's what you're going
right.
to have to do. But I think it really shows it's also the way you come in. If you come in with this translator, you've gone to the effort, you've gone to the time to find somebody to act as that puente, as that bridge. Already they're like, oh, okay, yeah, they're coming in here trying to understand how we do things and not just come in and say, oh, no, well, this is the way. I've helped so many companies, Kunal, they come into Latin America and they go, no, 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 this is the way we do this. And we have to explain to them, we understand that because I've practiced outside of strictly, the environmental and regulatory space, especially on labor issues. You find this for companies and you have to explain to them, we understand that you are a company in the US, it's 24 hours. But for example, in Costa Rica, the Ministry of Labor puts out a list every year of the mandatory holidays. And so if you want, you cannot require an employee to work on those days. You can ask them to volunteer. You're required to pay them double time, but you can't mandate it. And that is so hard for some American companies where we're this go-go 24-hour culture to understand. So I think coming into those countries with a certain level of humility, deep listening, deep respect, and say, okay, well, this is how we do things in our country. We understand how you do things here. What can we do? What can we make work? How can we find solutions?
And relatedly, what's the work culture like there? Maybe you can explain to the viewers as well. How do, again, my perspective is very US centric, at least, today. Uh, Everyone's working 24/7. Like it's a different sort of work culture. Like you rightly said, employers can mandate longer hours, and maybe talk a little bit of how do people work? How are they the most productive and best sort
I
of?
I
i- i-
think in Latin America, it always shocks people. Super hardworking. Our labor
Right.
codes provide for 40 to 48-hour, 6-day weeks. This is an incredibly hardworking people in almost all the countries of the region. Of course, there are differences. Maybe a Caribbean country is different than Santiago. We're a vast region. But if we're speaking very high level, very hardworking, when they're off, they're off. I think not at the senior management level. I think senior management and VP level has been corrupted or polluted or blessed, however you want to look at it. I think they're reachable on Slack and Teams 24 hours a day around the world. But if we're talking about your factory labor force, let's talk about that. Or you've got a call center. These people are going to be working 6 days a week by law. You're allowed 40 to 48-hour weeks, not like the French 35. And so very hardworking, but they are given their rest today. And that is something that they will want to take. And they are, very, the family is a big focus in Latin America and your friends and your social networks. And so I think that Latin Americans as a general, very general standard are very pro-social, very communitarian, and definitely going to want to be able to have some time away from work to engage with their families and friends.
Amazing, amazing. So Melissa, let's sort of, wrap up a little bit here. Just want to kind of maybe ask you one general question.
Sure.
Where do you see the world going? Is it getting less regulated? Where are we going as a society?
I absolutely see an increase in regulation. I do not see it slowing down. But what I think everybody needs to have top of mind is we are living in an exciting and chaotic time of shifting global alliances. And you have to be aware of the BRICS. You've got to be thinking about Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Colombia is petitioning to join the BRICS. You have more and more new alliances. And so you see super interesting things like everybody had thought it was going to be the EU, the anointed leader in environmental things, driving the global agenda. And now you have China imposing deforestation traceability on meat producers in Brazil, already having done a pilot study on it. Big news today out of the NGOs from Brazil over this year, just in this summer, over in China, meeting with officials. So I think that we need to be thinking that the source of regulations may be changing. It may not be LATAM adopting EU standards forever. I can see a decanol when we have LATAM adopting Chinese standards on traceability, deforestation, ESG commitments, decarbonization of the supply chain. I do not think that the source of regulatory truth will always remain in the global north or in the global west.
Amazing. Great. Well, Melissa, what a pleasure to speak to you. As always, certainly very inciting conversation for me personally. I'm sure for all the viewers. And I'm sure there are folks out there from our network here listening and will want to figure out ways to enter into LATAM. Maybe just tell the viewers, what's the best way to get in touch with you? How should, if they need some help here, what's the best way to sort of get in touch with you?
First, as always, tell me that Canal sent you. That's the first thing. And second, I'm very active on LinkedIn. I have a free newsletter that they're welcome to sign up for every Monday in their inbox. They could get my Around Latin America. That's out there, been going on for over 3 years now. My website is .com. That's AMBIENTE legal.com. And on there, I have, articles, blog, ways to sign up for the newsletter and way to contact me. And I'm sure that you'll include a link to that. And email me, mon@ambientelegal.com. Happy to help. And like I said, for things I don't do, I'm happy to get you encaminado on the right path. If you are one of those LATAM companies coming north, I have amigos that can help you there, even though I don't do that.
Fantastic. Well, Melissa, we'll put all this information for everyone in our podcast when it's live. But we really appreciate all your insights, and I highly encourage everyone to get in touch with Melissa if you're trying to navigate the LATAM landscape here. So appreciate it, Melissa. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Canal. Thanks for the great question.
Of course.